I wanted to ask you about Harald Bode.
Oh, good. Good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tell me about him.
Harald Bode, a man who spanned 3 generations of electroacoustic music. The first generation, in which he built instruments like the varbo-formant organ and some other things, the Melochord, and played those instruments on what was known as light radio. I guess we would call this midstream pop or something in American terminology. Light music being non-symphonic music. That was back all the way back into the 30s. Harald doing that as a young man. Then his instruments being used in the Cologne studio at the early 50s, albeit briefly. The Troutwine monochord and the Bode Melochord were both in the Cologne studio. They were used a bit by Eimert and a few other composers of the original group at Cologne. And essentially when Stockhausen came in, he said, we shouldn't be using these instruments. This should be sine waves and et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, so they were pretty much not put to use after that. And then finally, when Harald came to the United States and worked at Este and did a generation of organs and things, and then when he started working with Bob Moog and had things like vocoders and frequency shifters and things like that, sometimes with the Moog imprimaturs, sometimes under Harald's name, a Bode frequency shifter, a Bode vocoder, and so forth. So an amazing man to have touched that many generations of people with electronic or electroacoustic music, and from early performance technique through the studio revolution idea, which is really what electronic music was about. Let's make the studio the instrument, the tape recorder the instrument, and not these other things. Let's make the tape recorder the instrument, not just the thing that is a repository of sounds of other instruments. And then finally, those advanced things. And then the other thing why Harald is important is in 1961, he developed this 2 tape machines. He had a tape recorder and a Echoplex, like infinite loop tape recorder, and a strip of modules down at the bottom, filter, ring modulator, the things that people knew, but he put together into a modular package. That's in 61. Well, when Bob Moog starts designing the analog voltage controlled modular synthesizer in 1964, one of the key words is modular. And as Bob told me, oh yeah, of course, I did that. I saw Harald's work like everybody did in the community, of designers. And that's pretty much why I decided modular. Extremely important.
What did Bode use to connect his modules together?
Patch cords.
Yeah?
Yeah. Pretty much same as
most
people.
Standard format.
They didn't look like this rack mount stuff that Bob did, the 900 series that Bob did. They were kind of little short, one of a kind.
Yeah, but Bob's first modular was not.
No, I've got pictures of that. As a matter of fact, the first modules that Bob built were, 2 oscillators and 2 amplifiers.
Yeah.
That was the first Moog synthesizer. Little known fact, the first Moog synthesizer was polyphonic. When Herb Deutsch acted as a catalyst, Herb Deutsch is a Long Island composer at Hofstra, and he met Bob Moog, I think at a teacher's conference or something, and invited Bob into the city to hear some concerts, and Bob was very stimulated. Bob had been building theremins and kind of ersatz guitar amps, to tell you the truth. I mean, they were too clean. As a good engineer, he thought, well, I'll make this guitar amp that's nice and clean. And, nobody wanted that, of course. He didn't know that at the time. But anyhow, he went to some of these avant-garde concerts or jazz concerts that Herb was into. And they started talking, and Herb came up to Trumansburg, I guess, a couple of times. And, Bob did the designing. Let's keep that clear. Herb is he's not the designer of the Moog synthesizer, but he certainly acted as a stimulus. for that to happen. And the first version that they had was polyphonic. Both of them told me this. And I said, well, yeah, why did you reject that? He says, well, we both felt, and Bob particularly said it sounds like an organ, and we got organs. We don't need another organ. So the really radical things about the Moog synthesizer, which they did adopt, I find that, well, three. It was voltage controlled, meaning that you could take signals to manipulate elements like pitch, timbre, loudness, which would be frequency, spectrum or cutoff frequency of a filter, and the intensity of an amp, in signal terms. And when you could manipulate these elements much more rapidly and smoothly and interchangeably than you could by doing things by hand. Then it was modular, which meant you could design new ideas and new modules and put them in and incorporate them right along with the other modules. It could grow. And it was monophonic. Now, a lot of people erroneously think that monophony is a subset of polyphony. Oh, if I have a polyphonic instrument, I can play it monophonically, one note at a time. It doesn't even work on instruments. Think of the piano. When you play a piano, if you play a single line, one note at a time, you still have the possibility of overlapping notes, for one thing, which most acoustic instruments that are monophonic don't do. Okay, in other words, when you play a trumpet, you go from one note to the other. They really do not overlap. One takes the place of the other. And there are probably 800 to 1,000 monophonic instruments in the world, and a dozen or so polyphonic instruments. And as a matter of fact, I guess it was Hugh Kane who made the comment that that the musical tradition grew out of monophonic instruments. When the Moog synthesizer came out, it was monophonic. It played one note. And of course, there was a howl of protest from keyboard players. They were so used to playing chords and so forth and so on. I think a few of them interpreted it properly. Jan Hammer, for instance, who had played a variety of instruments. He was first a drummer, and then he played keyboards, but I think he recognized instantly what a monophonic instrument is. It floats in a sea of pitch, of frequency, and people are not aware of this until you make them listen to it. Listen to a big band, and everybody is deviating in pitch one way or the other. Even if you could play those parts on a keyboard, you wouldn't be able to control them in the same way. Again, degrees of freedom. A string quartet has more degrees of freedom than playing four notes on a keyboard. Maybe people like Jan, Stu Goldberg, a handful, Tom Coster, really had a feel for what a solo line sounds like. And then they began to use the synthesizer that way. Keith Emerson, he too he took actually modular systems on stage, big modular Moogs, and really made them scream. I mean, so different people sort of added their voice to this realization that, well, I guess one note is not so bad after all. We don't have any trumpets that play chords. We don't have any oboes that play chords. And really, when people were playing chords on a guitar, they were sitting at the back of the band next to the keyboard player and comping. And, while Louis Armstrong was up front blowing his cornet solos, okay? It's very curious that you would expect keyboard players to sort of want mother polyphony, mother chord, and want to go back to it. And the irony is, as soon as we had polyphonic synthesizers, that's exactly where they went. And where did they go? Back to the back of the band to make textures and to comp. When they were up in the front of the band, Keith Emerson, Jan Hammer, Tom Coster, there were others, certainly, Billy Preston, any number of people that began to understand, oh, this is what you do with a monophonic line, and especially the pitch bending, the modulations, and all the things that you expect out of a monophonic expression. If you play it like a one-note organ, of course, it's useless. It really is something poor. But again, monophony is not a wannabe polyphony. It is its own thing. Polyphony has its problems, same as monophony does. You know, you can access many notes with a keyboard, and Bob pointed this out to me. It's a reliable way to access a lot of notes, one after the other, and so forth, but not particularly viable as a solo instrument. And even to this day, when people do MIDI productions and things like that, often they will call in a saxophone or a guitar player, you know, a non-keyboard kind of interface of some sort to play the lead lines or to play the solos. Why? Well, because this terrace-stepped keyboard expression is not inherently hospitable to monophonic expression. It tends to be fixed in pitch, historically, keyboards have been, and then the Moog synthesizer comes along and all of a sudden frees it from that. People are just not ready. So anyhow, those three elements made the Moog radical, actually. It was modular, it was monophonic, and it was voltage controlled. So most of those elements continued to find their way into the marketplace except monophony. And as I pointed out, yeah, and I don't think it was just an era. I think it was the very fact that some people dealt with a monophonic line and learned how to project it and to become a focus of attention. In general, I mean, you have your Bill Evans of the world and your Oscar Petersons, and they're marvelous artists. But in an ensemble, in a jazz expression, for instance, if the keyboard player takes a ride and then the horn person takes a ride, who gets the bigger hand? The monophonic expression is like a human voice. It really is the basis. It's from here. It's not as mechanistic. A piano, you're not even in contact with a vibrating element, like a reed or a string. You're closer to it somehow. So monophony was not something to overcome. It was something to understand and to utilize, to exploit. And then, of course, musical tastes change. And then we had punk, which came in and said, oh, you know, these guys, they're playing their flatulent, overblown, progressive rock, you know, with all the time signature changes and, you know, their virtuosity and all this sort of stuff. So it became passe to be virtuoso. So